In this video, I'm going to show you how to create this animated CSS hamburger menu. It's written in only CSS with no JavaScript at all, and it's using CSS variables for pretty much everything. So if you want to change something like the height or length of the bars, you can do that in one place and all of the rest of the code will automatically update to take that into account. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream projects sooner. And as you can see, we have our hamburger menu on the right hand side of the screen and we have this really smooth animation. And again, everything is just CSS only, and it's also completely responsive for accessibility, which is really great. So you can use the spacebar and tab and it's going to work just fine. Now, like I said, this is all using CSS variables. So if I went into my code and I changed the bar height to be really big, like 20 pixels, for example, you can see when I click, the X is still formed perfectly to the exact size to make a perfect X. I can also come in here and I can change, for example, the gap instead. Let's make that really large. And now when I click, you can see again, still the X is perfectly formed. So I can change one variable in my CSS code and all of the rest of the code just falls into place perfectly. This is something that almost no other hamburger menu you see is going to do because they're all super hard coded and really finicky, but this code is automatically going to make adjustments based on the variables you define. Now let's bring this code back to what we had before and I can actually show you how to start building this. So the first thing we need is we need to have an index.html file and we're going to need some CSS. So let's do that in a styles.css. So I can come in here, get all my boilerplate code using Emmet. And if you want to learn how I did that, I have a full tutorial on it. I'll link in the cards and description for you on Emmet. And then we can come in here and we can create a link tag. We're going to do CSS just like that. Now inside of the body here, we just need to define a few things. We need something for this hamburger menu as well as the sidebar. Now most hamburger menus that you see are going to use a bunch of spans that have some type of like class on them like this, and it's going to have 3 spans, one for each different row. But this is really clunky. I like to keep my HTML as clean as possible. So in our case, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use a label, and this label I'm going to give a class here of hamburger menu. Close off that label. There we go. And then inside this label, I'm going to put a checkbox. Now, the reason I'm putting a checkbox inside of here is because we're doing this with just CSS and we're not using any JavaScript at all. And a checkbox is a great way for us to check if something is currently being clicked and to toggle between an open and closed state. Otherwise, you would need JavaScript to do this. But in our case, we're doing this with just CSS. Now, once that's done, we can just go ahead and create our sidebar. I'm going to use an aside element for that. I'm just going to give it the class of sidebar. Make sure I spell this properly. There we go. So now we have an aside, which has the class of sidebar. The fact that this is an aside doesn't matter. It's just for accessibility purposes. And inside of here, I'm just going to put a nav. And inside that nav, I'm just going to have a few divs that just say like this is the sidebar. It doesn't matter what the sidebar content is. All we need is an element with the class of sidebar, and that's all that matters. And this label with the input is going to take care of everything you can see for our hamburger menu. So the entire animation, the 3 lines, and everything else that you can think of is all taken care of by this one single section right here. Now what we can do is we can open this up with live server so we can actually see what we're working with. And as you can see, we have our checkbox and we have our aside section that says this is the sidebar. So now we can finally work on actually styling out what's going on. So instead of our styles.css, the very first thing that I like to do inside of every style sheet is I like to get my before, my after, and every element. So I just like to select essentially everything. And I like to set my box sizing to border box. If you're unfamiliar what this does, I have a full tutorial covering this and the box model. I'll link in the cards and description for you. But if we give this a quick save, you'll notice nothing really happens because this is only useful when we start defining things like widths and heights and so on. So the next thing I want to do is on our body, I'm just going to get rid of any margin that we have. The reason I want to do that is because I want to make sure our sidebar is pushed all the way against the side of our screen, and we need to remove our margin to do that. So now you can see our margin is gone. I can zoom this in a little bit more for you. Now the next thing that I want to do is I want to define some CSS variables. If you're unfamiliar with CSS variables, again, I have a full tutorial on that. I'll link in the cards and description for you. But we're going to define these on our root element, and we're just going to define a few to start. So we want to have a bar width. That's going to be how wide our hamburger bar is going to be. So for now, let's just come in here. We'll say 60 pixels. We're next going to have a bar height. So we can say bar height, and that's going to be 8 pixels. And then we also need to have a gap. So we're going to call that hamburger gap, which we're going to set to 6 pixels as well. There we go. So now if we give that a save, you'll notice nothing changes, and that's just because these are CSS variables that we can use later. And these are some of the variables we're going to create where you can change them, and the entire rest of the code is just going to work perfectly because it's going to modify based off of these different variables. This is why I really like using CSS variables, because it means I can say, okay, here's what my width is, and the rest of my code will just work based on whatever I set this variable to. Now the next step for us is going to get those 3 separate lines, because as you notice, we didn't put anything special in our HTML for those lines, so we need to create that essentially from scratch. And the way I'm going to do that is using a before element, an after element, as well as this input itself as the elements for our 3 different lines. So what we can do is we can come down here and we can select our hamburger. And what did I call this? Hamburger menu? Yeah, hamburger menu. And what I want to do is I want to get the before element. I also want to select my hamburger menu, and I want to get the checkbox that's inside of it. So that is just our input inside of it. And I also want to get the after element as well. So this is getting 3 different things. First of all, we have our input, which is just that checkbox. Then we have our after and before element, which are elements we can create. So if we set here the content to an empty string, that's going to give our before and after elements content, which is going to make them show up on the screen. And then we can actually style what they want to look like. So we can, for example, set a width here. And our width is our bar width. So we'll do that. Same exact thing for our height. It's just going to be our height instead of our width for our bar. The next thing I can do is set some kind of background color. So in our case, what I want to do is I actually want to define that as a variable. So we're going to have essentially a foreground and a background variable. So we're going to say foreground is going to be 333 and background, we're going to set this to white, just like that. So now I can just say that this is going to be our foreground color. There we go. So now if I save, you'll notice again, our checkbox has been moved out to the side because some of this stuff is starting to show up, but we still can't quite see anything yet. The reason for this is because by default, all these different elements are display inline, and that's because a label here is display inline, and we need to modify that to be flexbox based because we want to stack these on top of each other like we have over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my overall hamburger menu. I'm just going to change the display here to flex. Automatically, by doing that, you can now see we have some bars showing up on the right-hand side of our screen. And if I change the flex direction to column, that's going to stack them on top of each other. And then I can space them out using this hamburger gap. So I can say the gap is that hamburger gap variable, and that's going to put some space between these different elements. I can also come in here and add a border radius. And if I want to have a pill shape, I can just use a large number like 9,999, and that's going to give me some perfectly capped off borders just like that. Now, obviously, you notice our input doesn't quite look right because it's still styled as a checkbox, so we need to do some extra stuff to make it so that this input looks like we want it to. The first thing we can do is we can set the appearance to none. That by default is going to take care of a lot of the work for us. As you can see, it has removed the default appearance and just replaced it with whatever we hard-coded here for our height and width. Also, we can remove any padding and margin that is applied by default, and that's going to get our line back into position with the rest of our lines, which is great. And then finally, what we can do is we can make sure the outline is set to none, so that way when we actually hover over this, as you can see, if I hover over this, you may actually get some kind of outline showing up, just like that. We don't want that to show up, so I'm going to put the outline set to none so we don't get any weird outline stuff showing up. And I'm also going to come in here and I'm going to say pointer events none, and then just make sure I can't click on this checkbox at all. Instead, I want all my interactions with the checkbox to be through our label element right here. And the reason I wrapped my label or my input inside the label is that way when I click on my label, it'll check and uncheck my checkbox for me. So when I click anywhere inside of this space where my label is, which is just these 3 different lines, then I'll actually check and uncheck my checkbox. I can actually demonstrate that by inspecting the page here. I'll zoom this in a little bit. And if I look at my input right here, when I click on this, it's actually checking and unchecking my input. We can't quite see that, but what I can do inside my code is I can go hamburger menu, I can check for the input, and I can check for the checked property, just like that. And I can just say background is going to be red. So now I can see I'm checking and unchecking my checkbox by clicking anywhere inside these 3 elements. And I can use that checked property to animate between my open and closed state instead of just changing the color to red. So for now, I'll just comment that out. Now the next thing I want to work on is styling out my hamburger menu. If I just come in here, I set the background to red, you're going to notice it actually fills the full width of my screen. I don't want that. So instead, I'm going to set the width to max content. That's just going to make it so the width fills up the full space of whatever I have inside of it, which in our case is these 3 different lines. I can remove that background from now since we don't actually need it. I can go ahead and actually position this where we want it, and I'm going to be using position absolute to do that. So I can say position absolute. We can give it a top position and a left position. In our case, I'm going to make those both 5 pixels. So we'll come down here, a left of 5 pixels, and now you can see that it's showing up right there in the top left-hand corner, but our sidebar is now showing up behind it because we positioned this absolutely. For now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to comment out the sidebar so it's not there, because I want to focus primarily on this hamburger menu first. Now, a couple other things I want to do. I want to set the Z index to some number that's larger than 1 or 0. So I'm going to set it to 2 here. That way it shows up over top of our sidebar when we start to open and close it. As you can see here, when I open and close, I want to make sure it shows up over top the sidebar. The next thing that I want to do inside of here is I want to set my cursor to pointer. That way when I hover this, I can see that it looks like it's a clickable element, which is great. And then the last thing I want to do is I want to take this top and left position, and I want to actually break it out into a variable. We're going to call this hamburger margin. I'm going to set it to 5 pixels, and then I'll replace both of these with that variable hamburger margin. Now the main reason that I'm doing that, and let's actually increase this a little bit, let's make it 8 for example, there we go. The main reason I'm doing that is so when I open up my sidebar, it actually pushes my content down based on the height of my hamburger menu, and we need to take into account that top position up there in order to do that. So now is when we can actually work on the fun part of this. As you can see when I click on this, I want to do the animation where the middle bar fades out and the other 2 bars essentially become this like X shape. So what we can do in order to do that is we can go down to here where we had this input check section. So if I just uncomment this, there you go. You can see that whenever it's checked, it's going to be red. So right now we're just changing it to red. Instead, I want to essentially reduce this to a width of 0 and make the opacity go down to 0 as well. So on our input, whenever it is currently checked, we can say our opacity is going to be 0 and our width is going to be 0. So now you can see that that middle bar is disappearing whenever it is currently checked. Now I obviously want to animate this, so we're going to make a transition for this instead. So what I can do up here inside of where I've defined my transition for everything, all my different styles, what I can do is I can define a transition. In this transition, I want to transition the opacity property, and I want to transition it based on some type of timing function. And I want this to be the same for everything that I animate. So the sidebar, the actual X being formed, all of that is going to work on the exact same timing function. So I'm going to turn that into a variable. I'm just going to call it animation timing. Just like that. And I can do the exact same thing with my width. I want it to follow the exact same animation timing. So I'm going to transition both the opacity and the width in our case. So what I can come up here and I can do, if I go over into my root, I can say animation timing, and I can define this as like 200 milliseconds ease in out. So now you can see when I click, it's slowly going down to a size of 0 and it's fading out for us. Now to style our X, as you can see when I click here, the other 2 turn into an X. That's going to be quite a bit more complicated both for the selector as well as for the CSS. So we can come in here, we can say hamburger menu, and I want to determine if the input is currently checked. Let's actually move this down here. There we go. So I could come in here and I say input checked, but that's selecting the actual input element. Instead, I want to select the before element, but I want to only do it when the input is checked. To do that, we need to use this special has property. So we're saying, does the hamburger menu have an input that's checked inside of it? If so, then select the before element of our hamburger menu. Now this has selector is relatively new in CSS, so if you're unfamiliar with it, I have a full video on it. I'll link in the cards and description for you. Now with this done, obviously we need to do a rotation, so let's rotate this 45 degrees and see exactly what this looks like. So if we click, you can see that this has rotated 45 degrees, just like we expect it to, but obviously it's not quite like we want. It's automatically happening, and it's rotating around the center instead of around the left side. As you can see over here, this rotates around the left-hand side point, so that's what we want to emulate. So if we go back here, we can actually set a transform origin, and this transform origin, I want it to be in the left center. And now if I save, you can see it rotates around the left-hand side instead of the right-hand side, which is great. We can do the exact same thing with our after element instead, so we can change this to after, and we can rotate it the opposite direction. And now you can see we have the beginnings of our X being formed, but obviously it doesn't quite look right. So we need a lot of CSS and math to make this look like we want it to. So in order to figure out how our X should look, we need to figure out how long these lines should be. As you can see, these lines start out quite long, but when I click, they shorten down the length that they are so that they can fit within the space that we have. And in order to figure out what this length should be, we're actually going to use trigonometry. I know that sounds super complicated and crazy, but essentially we're just using some really simple math in order to do this. So what we need to do is we need to first determine the height of our element in order to determine what the length of the diagonal needs to be to fit within that height. So we're going to come up here and create a brand new variable. We're going to call this hamburger height, and this is going to be the height of our entire hamburger menu. And this is actually relatively easy to calculate because we have 3 bars and we have 2 gaps between those bars. So we know the height is just 3 times our bar length and 2 times our gap. So we can come in here and we can do a calculation. We would take in the height that we have here, which is our bar height. We know we need to multiply that by 3. Looks like I got an extra var in here. There we go. And then I can just add in the height that we're going to be using for our gap. So we can say hamburger gap, just like that. Again, it gave me one too many vars. We want to multiply this by 2 because there are 2 total gaps and there are 3 total bars worth of height. That right there is going to give us the total height of our container. And then we can determine what the actual width of our bars are going to be. Now, in order to do that, I'm going to put a menu or a variable inside of our hamburger menu, and we're going to call this the X width. So this is the width of our bars when we're in the X shape. This is going to be a calculation, which is going to be based on that hamburger height. And in order to get the length of the diagonal using trigonometry, all we need to do is multiply this by the square root of 2 because we're using a right angle here. So since we're using a right angle, we can just multiply by this variable, which is just the square root of 2. You can write this out yourself or just Google square root of 2, and it will give you a variable for the square root of 2. If you multiply your height by that variable, it'll give you the length right here that we need to use. And again, that's because we're using the right angle triangle here. Now I know this part may have been a little confusing with the math, but just know all we've done is we've just written some math out that this X width variable will just calculate what the width of our actual line needs to be so it's not quite so long. Now we can do down here, we can say that our width is going to be that X width variable, just like that. So now if I save on both of these, you'll notice immediately that this looks a lot more like an X. It's still not quite perfect, but it's getting there. The only other thing we need to do is just make sure that we do a little bit of an offset, because we're doing currently our rotation around the left center sides. So based on the height of our actual bar, we need to make sure we offset our element a little bit just because of the way that we're rotating. Because in a normal triangle, you don't have the width of a bar, a line that you're working with. You're working with essentially infinitely thin lines, and that's why everything works super cleanly. But in our case, we have this thick bar that we need to account for. So we need to essentially offset our element up and down based on the width or the height of our bar. So to do that, we can come in here and we can actually do a translate. And we want to translate the X position by 0, so we can put 0 here, but we want to translate the Y position by essentially half of the height of the bar. So I can come in here with a calculation where I get my bar height, and I can just divide that by 2. And in our case, this before element, we want to move up, so I'll divide by -2. I'm going to do the exact same thing down here, but I'm going to divide by just 2. And now if I save, you'll see that now our X actually looks really good, and we can animate between both of these different elements. So to quickly recap what we did, we calculated the length of our X line based on some trigonometry based on the height, and we know that this is a 45-degree angle because we're rotating here by 45 degrees. We know it's a 90-degree triangle and so on. So we know exactly what that line length of square root of 2 needs to be, do that multiplication. And then since we actually have a line that's greater than 0 pixels wide, we just need to offset by half of that line size in order to make sure everything lines up perfectly. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to make sure that this actually animates super smoothly, so we need to add some additional things inside of our transition. So we're currently doing opacity and we're doing width, so I want to copy this down for a few more things because we need to do the rotate. Let me copy and rotate, and we have a translate that we need to do as well. So now if I save, you can see that this is perfectly smoothly animating, which is great. Now, while we're making these modifications, you'll notice on this example, the color actually changes. So I want to make sure that I animate that as well. So I'll just come in here with our background color, and I'll make sure that that will animate super smoothly as well. And that's all we need to do for our transition here. Now, the next thing we can work on since we have our fully animated X is making sure that it works if we change our numbers. So let's say I change our bar height to 18 and I click, you can see our X still perfectly forms. So it looks like no matter what our values are, our X is going to work exactly like we want it to. So let's actually go ahead and make our sidebar do what we want. Let's add it back in, and let's make sure we can animate it in and out. So we'll scroll all the way to the bottom here. I'm going to select our sidebar, and all I want to do by default is I just want to translate this -100%, and that's just going to hide it off the edge of our screen just like that. Now for now, I'm going to uncomment this just so we can actually see our sidebar, but the next thing we need to do is move our sidebar down below our actual menu. So we can put some margin on the top to do this, and this is going to be a calculation based on some variables. So we actually know the height of our hamburger menu just like that. And then we can add in the margin that we calculated. That's just this padding at the top here that we put at the top. So we can come in here and we can say that we have our hamburger margin. We can add into the top there as well. And then we can just put in some spacing amount like 1 rem, and that'll just give us 1 rem space below. If we remove that, you can see it's bunched up right next to it. We don't quite want that, so we're just going to give it a little bit of space. So that right there is already putting our sidebar in the right location. Now the next thing we need to do is give it some styles, so it's like some background, some padding, and so on. So let's come in here with the background color. We can use our variables for this. And in our case, I'm going to be using the foreground variable color. And the reason for that is because I want this to be that darker color. It kind of like is the opposite of our normal background color. And the color here is going to be our background color that we've defined. And that's again because this is the inverse of our normal website colors. Now I don't want the sidebar to fill the full width, so I'm going to give it a max width. In our case, I'm going to call this 10 rem. There we go. Just to give it a maximum size that it can be. And that way, no matter what size our screen is, it's always only taking up a certain amount of space. Also, I want to change the height here to be a little bit better. So we can come in here with a height, and I want to make this 100 VH. There we go. That's going to fill 100% of the height, but you'll notice we have a little bit of a scroll here. So instead of my margin on the top, I want to set this as padding, and that should hopefully take care of that problem for us. As you can see, it removed our scroll bar, which is great. Our bar right here for our actual X is still there, but we can't see it because it's the same color as our background. We'll fix that in a little bit. Also, I want to come in here and I actually want to set this as a minimum height. That way, if our sidebar needs to scroll, it can scroll. Next thing I want to do is specify the rest of the padding for our element. So I'm going to make sure I do this before my padding top, because I'm going to say we have 0.5 rem and 1 rem of padding. So we have a lot of padding on the right and the left and not quite as much on the top and bottom. Then finally, what I want to do is I can add this translate back in, and I want to add a transition on that. So we'll say transition here. Whoops. Transition is going to be on the translate property. And we want to use that same timing we've been using for everything else, that animation timing. So right now it is hidden by default, but if we have a hamburger menu that has an input that is checked, this is some code we've already talked about before, then what I want to do is I want to select the sidebar directly after it. That's what this plus button does right here. Now we've covered quite a few complex selectors in this video, like this plus selector and this has selector. And if you want to learn everything you need to know about CSS selectors, I have a completely free cheat sheet you can download. It's going to be linked in the description of this video, and it's going to cover all the CSS selectors you need to know, such as checked and this plus icon and all the other things you can think of, like before and after. All those are going to be covered for you. So inside of here, all we need to do is just set our translate property to 0. That's just going to reset us. So now when I click on this, you can see that the sidebar is animating in and out. The last thing we have left is to worry about colors as well as accessibility. So the colors are going to be relatively straightforward. What I can do is I can just check that when our hamburger menu has an input that is checked, what I want to do is I just want to swap my colors. So the foreground here, foreground is going to be set to that white color, and our background is going to be set to that darker black color. So now when I click, you can see that my X has perfectly transferred its colors, and it's doing that all because of right here, we're changing our foreground and background color, essentially swapping the two. And the last thing we need to do is deal with accessibility, because if someone can't see or they use the keyboard to navigate, we want to make sure that when they are actually navigated onto this, that you can see that we have some type of animation showing up or some type of highlighting showing up, showing that it is actually currently selected. And to do this is actually quite easy. What we can do is we can select our hamburger menu, and we want to check to see if it has an input that has a focus of visible. That just means that currently you are tabbed onto something, but it doesn't count when you click on it, because we don't really need those styles to show up when we just click on this. So if we currently have a focus that is visible based on tabbing onto it, then we can get the before element. We can do the exact same thing for our after element, and we can do the exact same thing for selecting our actual input, just like this. This is going to select our input, our before, and our after element whenever we are focused on our input, so whenever we're tabbed onto our checkbox. And what I want to do is I want to set a border that is going to be 1 pixel, and it's going to be the exact same color as our background. So essentially, it's not even going to show up. So if I save, and I actually tab onto this in our example here, you can see that we have that 1 pixel border showing up, but it's the exact same color as the background, so it's really hard to see. When the color is white here, you can see that you really can't see anything at all, other than that a little bit of size is removed just because of the way that widths and heights and stuff work with borders. But what we can do on top of this is add a box shadow and make it work like a second border. To do that, we can set zeros for every single thing except for the fourth property, and this will be the width of our border. In our case, we're going to make this another 1 pixel wide border. And we're going to set this to our foreground color. So this color is going to match the color of our actual lines. So now you can see if I tab onto this, that this color has given us essentially a white outline, and then we just have this black section here that is showing up. So our border is that black section, and then the white outline is our actual box shadow. And here it's reversed. Our box shadow is black while our border is white. And that gives us this really nice outline effect that I think is really easy and clear to see for someone that can't actually see very well and relies on keyboard shortcuts to navigate. And that's all there is to creating this hamburger menu. If you enjoyed this video and really want to dive further into all the different CSS selectors we used, I highly recommend checking out my completely free CSS selector cheat sheet. It's going to be linked down in the description for you. With that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.